Elias Turner had always been a man who kept to himself. People who lived near the Arizona Territory in those days often knew each other's business, but Elias was different. He preferred quiet mornings, long rides, and the steady company of his horse, Dusty. His ranch sat far from the nearest town, close enough for supplies, but far enough that he could go days without seeing another person. That was how he liked it. Life made more sense to him out in the open land, where the wind carried the sound of moving grass and tall cliffs watched over empty plains like ancient guards. On this particular morning, the air was cool and thin. The sky, still pale from the fading night, slowly shifted to soft shades of orange and gold. Elias stepped outside his cabin and filled his lungs with the crisp air. The season had been dry, far drier than anyone expected. Even the small creeks near his land had shrunk down to thin silver lines that barely moved. Because of this, game had become harder to find. If Elias wanted meat, he had to ride farther than usual. He looked over the land as he saddled Dusty. The world was quiet. So quiet it almost felt like everything was holding its breath. Normally he would hear birds or see small animals rustling through the brush. But that morning there was nothing. Only stillness. He noticed it, but he didn't feel bothered. The desert often had moods of its own, and he had learned not to question them. Once Dusty was ready, Elias swung into the saddle with slow, practiced ease. He gently clicked his tongue, and the horse started forward. The trail that stretched ahead was familiar to him, worn into the earth by years of travel. He followed it toward the mountains where game usually gathered near sheltered patches of grass. As he rode, the sun climbed higher, revealing the rugged beauty of the land. Tall ridges rose along one side, sharp and bold like the spine of a giant creature sleeping under the desert floor. Far off in the distance, the desert rolled in waves. Sand, brush, scattered rocks, and the occasional twist of a stubborn tree that refused to surrender to the dry wind. Yet despite all this beauty, Elias could feel something different about that morning. There was an unusual quietness that didn't fit the way the desert usually behaved. Even Dusty seemed to sense it. The horse's ears twitched more than usual, turning left and right as if trying to listen for something that wasn't there. Elias patted the horse's neck. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "We're just heading out for a long ride, same as always." But deep down, he felt the same unease that his horse did. He wasn't scared, fear didn't guide him, but he was alert, more aware of his surroundings. Years of living close to the land had shaped him into someone who paid attention to the smallest changes. A shift in the wind, a quiet corner of the desert that should have been lively, or a missing sound that usually filled the air. These things meant something. They were warnings, sometimes small, sometimes important. Still, he continued riding, determined to find something to bring home. He guided Dusty toward a narrow stretch of land where tall rocks formed natural walls on both sides. He had walked through that path many times before. The shade there was cool, and sometimes he found deer resting close to the rock face. But that morning the area felt strangely empty. He slowed Dusty to a gentle walk, studying the ground for any tracks. The dry dirt held prints well, but all he saw were old marks left by animals that had passed days ago. Nothing fresh, nothing useful. He sighed softly. It wasn't unusual for hunting to take time, but he had hoped for better luck today. With the land so dry, he couldn't afford to return home with nothing. Instead of turning back, he decided to ride higher toward the foothills. Up there, the air was cooler, and small springs sometimes survived even during lean seasons. If he was going to find game, that would be the place. As he climbed the higher trails, the world opened even more. The sky stretched endlessly, and sunlight washed the rocks in warm yellow tones. Elias narrowed his eyes as he scanned the land. Everything looked calm and untouched. No movement, no sound. The silence followed him all the way to the ridge. It was the kind of quiet that made a person feel like the entire desert was listening. Elias wasn't a man who frightened easily, but he respected the land enough to know when something unusual was happening. He paused at the top of the ridge, letting Dusty rest while he looked across the vast desert. Far below, the land stretched out in all directions, endless and wide. He could see where the dry riverbeds cut through the sand and where small clusters of trees bent softly in the breeze. Even from that height, everything remained still. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Strangest quiet I've heard in a long while," he whispered to himself. The sun warmed his shoulders as he continued riding along the ridge. The stillness didn't break, not by birds, not by animals, not by the wind. Only the soft thud of Dusty's hooves on the rocky ground filled the air. Elias moved slowly, scanning the land for any sign of life. He wasn't only looking for animals now, he was listening, waiting for something, anything, that might explain the unusual silence. Soon he reached an area where the ridge sloped downward into a long valley. The valley was open and bright, dotted with brush and scattered boulders. It was a place where he had once seen plenty of game. If something was there, he would see it clearly. But the valley, too, was empty. He took a long breath. Something about that morning didn't sit right with him, yet he couldn't point to anything specific. The land didn't look damaged. There were no storms passing, no dust clouds rising from riders in the distance. It was just still. He turned Dusty slightly to the right, heading toward a creek bed he knew well. In good seasons, the creek flowed strong enough to attract all kinds of animals. In dry seasons, it held shallow pools that still provided water. If there was any place that could break this strange quiet, it would be there. The closer he drew to the creek bed, the thicker the brush became. Small bushes and low trees formed loose clusters, casting soft shadows on the ground. Elias leaned forward slightly, ready to spot any movement. Dusty walked carefully, avoiding loose stones that could make noise. At first glance, the creek looked ordinary. Thin water trickled along the center, catching the sunlight in shimmering streaks. But the area around it was just as silent as the rest of the desert. He began to guide Dusty closer, planning to check for fresh tracks near the water, when something faint drifted through the air. It wasn't a sound he could describe easily. It wasn't loud. It wasn't clear. It was just different. A soft, distant noise that didn't belong to the usual rhythm of the land. Dusty lifted his head sharply, ears pointed forward. Elias froze in place, not moving a muscle. The stillness around him deepened as he listened. There it was again, quiet, small, almost like a weak call carried by the breeze. Elias narrowed his eyes. He didn't know what it was, or who it came from, but it was enough to make his pulse tighten just a little. Something or someone was nearby, and whatever it was, it didn't sound strong. He had set out that morning expecting a simple day of hunting, but as he nudged Dusty forward and followed the faint sound, he felt the first shift in his day, the first sign that something unusual was waiting ahead. The quiet desert had been hiding something, and he was now riding straight toward it. Elias guided Dusty slowly toward the faint sound he had heard near the creek bed. It was soft, so soft that he wondered if the wind had played a trick on him. But Dusty had reacted too, and the horse rarely misheard anything. Years of riding together had taught Elias that when Dusty sensed something, it was worth paying attention. He kept his pace slow and careful. The brush grew thicker the closer he rode to the creek, and the ground turned softer under Dusty's hooves, holding moisture from the trickling water nearby. Elias listened hard, letting the quiet desert settle around him again, waiting for the sound to return. For a moment, nothing came. Only the soft rustle of leaves and the light splash of the shallow creek broke the silence. Then it came again. A small, weak sound, like someone trying to call out but not strong enough to do so. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was clear enough now for Elias to be sure it wasn't an animal. He guided Dusty toward the left side of the creek, following the sound as it slowly grew clearer. It wasn't steady. It came and went, as if whoever was making it was drifting in and out of awareness. That made Elias slow his pace even more, carefully scanning the ground and the spaces between the trees. The sun had risen enough to brighten the entire area, and its warm light made the nearby rocks glow softly. Elias moved aside a low branch with his hand as he leaned forward in the saddle. That was when he finally saw something near the base of a boulder. At first, it looked like a pile of dark cloth. It was so still that he almost rode past it, but Dusty stopped on his own, refusing to take another step. Elias narrowed his eyes and looked again. There, half in the shade, lay a young woman. He dismounted quietly, letting Dusty stand behind him. Elias approached on foot, careful not to startle her. The woman was dressed in simple, earth-colored clothing common among the Apache people of the region. One of her legs was bent at an odd angle, as if she had fallen hard. Her arm rested across her stomach, and her breathing was shallow, soft enough that he had to lean closer to see her chest rise and fall. She wasn't unconscious, but she was close to it. Her eyes were barely open, half hidden under strands of dark hair that had fallen across her face. When Elias stepped closer, her eyelashes fluttered the way a candle flickers before going out. Elias knelt beside her, speaking gently. "Ma'am? Can you hear me?" Her lips moved slightly, but no clear words formed. She tried to lift her head but didn't have the strength. Her face looked tired, not from anything harsh or alarming, but from exhaustion, like someone who had walked for too many days without enough rest or water. Elias looked around the area. The ground near her showed signs that she had been moving slowly, almost dragging herself before collapsing. A few broken branches nearby suggested she had tried to find shelter under the shade, but her strength had given out before she could get far. He spoke again, a little louder, but still calm. "You're safe now. I'm not here to trouble you. Just tell me if you can hear me." Her eyes shifted slightly, just enough to show she was aware of his presence. There was no fear in her expression, just weariness and confusion, like someone who wasn't sure where she was anymore. Elias felt something tighten in his chest. He wasn't a doctor, but he had tended to injured animals and even the occasional traveler over the years. He knew when someone needed care, and this woman clearly did. He reached into the small pouch on his belt and pulled out his water flask. "Here," he said softly, lifting her head just enough to let a few drops of water reach her lips. She swallowed slowly, as though every movement took effort. After a few more sips, she opened her eyes wider. They were dark, thoughtful eyes, full of quiet strength even in her weakened state. She looked at Elias with a mixture of surprise and uncertainty, as if she had not expected anyone to find her in this isolated place. "Rest," he said in a calm voice. "I won't harm you. I just want to help." She seemed to understand him, but she still struggled to speak. She made a small gesture with her hand, a slow, trembling movement that seemed meant to warn him of something. Elias watched closely, trying to understand. Her fingers lifted weakly toward the open desert behind him. Her voice came out in a faint whisper that he could barely hear. "Not safe." Elias felt the weight of those words settle into his thoughts. He didn't know what she meant, but it was enough to make him glance over his shoulder. The valley was empty. The desert was still. Yet, the uneasy silence that had followed him all morning lingered like a quiet warning. He returned his focus to the woman. "Did someone leave you here?" he asked gently. She blinked slowly as if trying to answer, but her strength failed again. Her eyes closed, though her breathing remained steady. Elias didn't press her further. She needed rest, not questions. He looked around one more time, scanning the horizon. There were no riders, no dust clouds, no footprints besides hers. But the strange quietness of the land, the faint sound she had made, the warning she tried to give, these things all told him that something had happened, something that had left her alone and exhausted in this quiet corner of the desert. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. He had no way of knowing if she had been separated from her group, if she had gotten lost, or if something else had taken place. All he knew was that she needed help, and there was no one else around to give it. Elias stood up and walked back to Dusty, patting the horse's side. "Easy, boy," he said softly. "We're helping someone today. Looks like the hunt can wait." He returned to the woman, thinking carefully about how to lift her without causing her discomfort. She was light, and when he gently slid his arms under her, she barely stirred. He moved slowly, giving her time to adjust to being lifted. Her head rested lightly against his shoulder, and he felt how weak her breathing was, soft and uneven. He laid her carefully across Dusty's saddle, making sure she was secure but comfortable. Her arm hung loosely at her side, so he adjusted it gently so it would rest safely across her body. Dusty stood perfectly still, as if understanding that this was not an ordinary situation. Before mounting, Elias took one more look around. The land remained silent, beautiful, open, but unsettling in its stillness. He couldn't shake the feeling that something unusual had happened earlier that morning, something that explained why the desert was so quiet and why this woman had been left alone near the creek. He mounted Dusty slowly, settling behind the woman so he could hold her steady on the ride. Once he was seated, he clicked his tongue softly, and Dusty began walking. They moved away from the creek bed, back toward Elias's ranch. The ride would be long, and he knew she needed care as soon as possible. Fresh water, rest, maybe a warm meal if she was awake enough to take it. As they traveled, the woman stirred a few times, whispering soft, unclear words. Elias leaned in, trying to understand, but her voice faded too quickly. Only one thing she said came through clearly enough for him to understand. "Not safe," she murmured again. Elias felt a small chill travel down his spine, not from fear, but from the knowledge that her words were not empty. Something had frightened her enough to linger in her thoughts, even while she drifted in and out of awareness. He looked ahead at the long trail leading home. Whatever had happened before he found her, whatever had left her weak and alone in the desert, he understood one thing with complete certainty. His simple morning of hunting had ended. Life had taken a turn he hadn't expected, and the woman he now carried home was at the center of a mystery he had only begun to uncover. Elias kept Dusty's pace slow and steady as he traveled away from the creek bed. The young Apache woman rested lightly in the saddle before him, her breathing soft and uneven. The desert stretched quiet and wide around them, but the strange silence that had followed the morning still hung in the air like a thin veil. Elias had spent years riding these trails, and he knew the land well enough to sense when something was off. Today was different, and the woman's faint words, "not safe," echoed in his mind with every gentle step Dusty took. The wind brushed past his face, carrying warm air and the faint scent of dry sagebrush. Normally, the desert breeze was filled with the sounds of distant birds or the rustling of small animals moving through the brush. But this time, there was nothing, no chirping, no scurrying, no distant calls. It felt as though the land was watching him, waiting for what would happen next. Elias shifted slightly in the saddle to better support the woman. She didn't wake, but her head rested against his shoulder in a way that made him even more certain that she had been through something difficult, too difficult for someone to face alone. He spoke softly, mostly to keep the silence from growing too thick. "You just hold on, ma'am. We'll get you somewhere safe soon. My cabin's not far once we cross the next ridge." The desert path ahead was familiar, but he rode with more caution than usual. Dusty's ears flicked back and forth, picking up sounds Elias couldn't hear. Several times, Dusty slowed on his own, sniffing the air or turning his head slightly as if trying to sense something unseen. Elias gently patted the horse's neck. "I know, boy." "I feel it too." The woman stirred suddenly, a soft gasp escaping her. Elias looked down at her face. Her eyelids trembled before she opened them halfway. Her gaze was unfocused, drifting like someone trying to remember where they were. She whispered something so faint, Elias almost missed it. "Did someone follow?" she murmured, her voice barely a breath. Elias leaned closer. "I don't see anyone," he said calmly. "You're safe with me for now." She blinked slowly as if trying to process his words. Her hand moved a little, though the gesture was weak. "They looked for me," she whispered. "Riders, many riders." Elias felt a slow heaviness settle in his chest. Riders. Many of them. He didn't know who they were, but the idea of a group searching the desert with purpose explained part of the strange silence that morning. If a group of people had passed through the area earlier, their presence could have frightened off the wildlife, leaving the desert unusually still. He didn't want to overwhelm her with questions, so he kept his voice gentle. "Don't worry about that now. You're safe. Try to rest. We'll be home soon." Her eyes slipped shut again, as if the effort of speaking had drained what little energy she had left. Elias looked ahead, his expression tightening in thought. He didn't know what the woman had been through or who she was running from, but he did know one thing. Bringing her home meant he had chosen a path he couldn't easily step away from. He had acted on instinct, picking her up from where she lay near the creek. He had acted from compassion, not wanting to leave someone in need behind. But now he carried not just a stranger, but a mystery. And mysteries in the desert often brought trouble. Still, he didn't regret helping her. His conscience wouldn't have allowed him to leave her there alone and exhausted, no matter what dangers might follow. As he continued the ride, the sun rose higher, warming the desert and casting long shadows behind rocks and distant shrubs. The heat shimmered gently across the sand, creating wavering lines that danced like faint mirages. Elias adjusted the woman's position slightly to shield her from the direct sunlight. He didn't want her becoming overheated. She already seemed fragile enough. The trail eventually curved around a tall stand of rock formations, large weathered stones that jutted out of the earth like old monuments. Elias guided Dusty through the narrow passage. The air inside the rocky area was cooler and shaded, providing temporary relief from the strengthening sun. As they passed between the rocks, the woman exhaled softly, as though the shade brought her comfort. Elias kept one hand on the reins and the other lightly around her to keep her steady. He had carried injured travelers before, but something about this situation felt different. The woman seemed not only tired but unsettled, as if she had been holding on to fear for too long. Once they exited the rock passage, the open land stretched ahead in wide, golden tones. The path home lay just beyond a gentle slope leading toward a low valley. From there, the cabin was less than 2 more hours away. Elias was about to urge Dusty onward when he noticed something in the distance. It was faint, barely noticeable. A thin line in the air far behind them, like soft dust rising from the desert floor. He narrowed his eyes. Dust trails usually meant someone, or something, was moving. He watched quietly for a long moment. The dust line grew taller, stretching upward in the warm sunlight. It was too far to make out the shape of riders, but he'd lived long enough in the territory to know that dust didn't rise on its own. Something was stirring it, something moving at a steady pace. Elias felt his heartbeat slow in cautious thought. He did not panic, but he understood the situation clearly. Someone was moving across the land behind him, and fast enough to lift a long ribbon of dust into the air. He didn't know if the approaching riders were searching for the woman or passing through for unrelated reasons. But with her weak warning echoing through his mind, he couldn't assume it was harmless. Being careless could place them both in danger. He clicked softly to Dusty, guiding him toward the valley but increasing the pace just a bit, not so fast as to disturb the woman's rest, but fast enough to put some distance between them and any potential riders behind. The woman shifted slightly in front of him as if sensing movement. He leaned down and spoke gently. "It's all right. We're just moving a little quicker." She didn't respond fully, but he heard a faint sigh, as if she trusted him enough to rest. Elias followed the familiar curve of the trail, letting the land guide him. The horizon slowly changed behind them. The tall ridge faded, and the open flats grew wider. The dust trail in the far distance grew smaller as he put more ground behind them. He didn't look back often, only enough to be cautious without drawing unnecessary fear into his own thoughts. Dusty remained calm, though alert, and that was enough for Elias. The horse's instincts were dependable. As they finally reached the slope leading to the valley, a soft breeze passed through, carrying the fresh scent of wild sage. The land felt calmer here, more welcoming. Elias relaxed slightly, though he stayed mindful of the situation. The woman stirred again, more alert this time. Her eyes opened halfway, and she looked at him with a tired but clearer gaze. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly. "To my cabin," Elias replied. "It's a safe place. You'll get water, rest, and time to recover." She blinked slowly, thinking. "Why, help me?" she whispered. Elias gave a small, gentle smile. "Because you needed someone, and I was there. That's enough reason." She looked at him for a long moment, as though weighing his words. Then her eyes softened, and she let her head rest again. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice drifting like a soft breath. Elias felt a warm sense of purpose settle in his chest. He didn't know her story yet, but he knew that helping her was the right thing to do. As Dusty's hooves moved steadily across the soft desert soil, Elias kept his focus forward. The cabin wasn't far now, a place with clean water, shade, and quiet, a place where she could rest safely without fear. But behind them, far across the desert, the faint dust line still lingered. Someone was out there. Someone was moving. And although Elias didn't yet know who they were, he understood that bringing the woman home had set something in motion, something he couldn't turn away from anymore. The decision he made at the creek had changed the direction of his day. Now, it was slowly changing the direction of his life. The afternoon sun had softened by the time Elias finally saw the familiar outline of his small ranch house. The cabin sat quietly among a few oak trees, their leaves moving gently in the warm breeze. The place wasn't large or fancy. It was simple. A sturdy wooden cabin, a small barn, a fenced area for Dusty, and a water barrel filled from the nearby spring. It wasn't much, but it was home. And today, that home was about to become a place of shelter for a stranger who needed help. As Dusty approached the cabin, the woman in front of Elias stirred again. She opened her eyes slowly, as if waking from a dream she didn't fully understand. Elias felt her shift, and he spoke softly, trying to comfort her. "We're here now," he said. "You can rest inside. It's quiet and safe." She blinked slowly, her eyes drifting over the small ranch as though seeing it through a haze. Her breathing eased just a little, as if she sensed she was no longer alone in the wild desert. Elias stopped Dusty near the porch and dismounted first. He made sure the woman was secure before helping her down carefully. She was light in his arms, almost weightless, and he carried her as gently as one would carry a small child who had fallen asleep on the ride home. Inside the cabin, the light was warm and soft. The wooden floor creaked slightly beneath Elias's boots. The air carried the scent of dried herbs he kept hanging from the beams, sage, rosemary, and another desert plant he used to keep bugs away. He laid her gently on his cot, adjusting the blanket so it covered her comfortably. The woman didn't resist. She simply closed her eyes, her face relaxing for the first time since he found her near the creek. It was the expression of someone who had been holding on for too long and had finally found a place to rest. Elias watched her a moment, making sure she was settled, then stepped to the small wash basin in the corner. He filled it with fresh water he'd drawn earlier that morning. He soaked a cloth in the cool water and returned to her side. With slow, careful movements, he touched the damp cloth to her forehead and cheeks. She reacted to the coolness, sighing softly. "You're safe here," he said in a low, steady voice. "Just rest. That's all you need to do." She opened her eyes a little, meeting his gaze. For a moment, she looked unsure, perhaps still trying to decide if she could truly trust him. Then her eyes softened, and she closed them again, letting the comfort of the cabin and Elias's gentle care wrap around her like a warm blanket. While she rested, Elias stepped outside to tend to Dusty. He removed the saddle, brushed the horse's coat, and gave him fresh water. Dusty nuzzled his shoulder in a quiet, familiar gesture. "You did good today," Elias said softly as he patted Dusty's neck. "Real good." After brushing the horse down, Elias gave him a little extra feed, knowing the long ride had been harder than usual with the added weight. Once Dusty was settled, Elias walked back to the cabin and paused at the doorway. The desert behind him stretched quiet and open, but he did not forget the faint dust trail he had seen earlier. The thought stayed in the back of his mind like a quiet cloud. Inside, the woman was resting peacefully. Elias set a small pot of water on his stove to warm. He planned to make a simple broth, nothing heavy, just something to give her strength when she woke. While he waited, he tidied the cabin quietly. He didn't want to wake her with loud movements. As he worked, he found himself thinking more deeply about her. He had rescued travelers before, people who had gotten lost or tired. But this was different. This woman had been alone in a quiet, unsettled part of the desert, too weak to call out for help. She had spoken of riders, of not being safe, and even in her weakened state, those were the thoughts that clung to her. What had she been running from? Who had she been with before she was alone? And why had the desert been so strangely quiet that morning? Elias didn't know the answers, but he knew he wanted to help her find them when she was strong enough. After some time, the broth finished cooking. Its gentle aroma filled the cabin, warm and comforting. Elias poured a small portion into a tin cup and carried it to the cot. The woman stirred slightly at the smell, opening her eyes halfway. Elias sat beside her. "Can you drink a little?" he asked gently. She nodded weakly. He lifted her head with one hand and held the cup to her lips with the other. She took small sips, each one giving her a little more strength. When she had drunk all she could manage, he set the cup aside and helped her lie back down. "What is your name?" he asked softly. She hesitated for a moment before whispering, "Nayland." Elias nodded. "Nayland," he repeated kindly. "It's good to meet you. I'm Elias Turner." She gave a small, tired smile. "Elias," she whispered, as if saying his name helped anchor her in the present. "You're safe here, Nayland," he said. "No one will trouble you." But at that, her expression changed slightly. She opened her eyes more fully, looking at him with quiet urgency. "You must be careful," she whispered. "They were searching. They may come this way." Elias kept his voice calm. Who were they? Nalin looked down as if gathering her thoughts. I don't know all of them, she said softly. But they looked for me. They didn't want me to return to my people. I left. When I could. I walked until I couldn't anymore. Elias listened without interrupting. She didn't share details, but the strain in her voice showed that the search she spoke of was something she had carried for a long time. He placed a gentle hand on the blanket near her shoulder, not touching her, but close enough for reassurance. You don't have to speak about it now, he said. Rest first. We can talk when you feel stronger. She nodded faintly, grateful for his patience. Evening slowly settled over the desert, painting the sky in soft streaks of pink and orange. Elias lit a lantern inside the cabin, its warm glow making the small room feel cozy. Outside, crickets began their nightly songs, and the breeze cooled. But as night deepened, Elias noticed something unexpected. Two of his neighbors, an older couple who lived a few miles away, passed near the ranch with their wagon. The husband raised a hand in greeting, and Elias stepped out to greet them quietly so he wouldn't disturb Nalin. Evening, Elias, the man called softly. We heard from a traveler that some folks were searching the area today. A group on horseback. Didn't say who they were looking for, but they were asking questions. Elias felt a small shift in his chest, calm but alert. Is that so? He asked. The man nodded. If you're heading out in the next day or two, just keep your eyes open. Elias thanked them, and they rode on, their wagon wheels fading into the distance. When he re-entered the cabin, he looked at Nalin, who was asleep again. The lantern's glow illuminated her peaceful face. She was safe for now. But the world outside had begun to move in her direction. Elias knew that helping her meant he had stepped into something deeper than simple kindness. Someone was searching the desert, and he had no way of knowing what they wanted or how far they would go. Yet when he looked at Nalin, resting quietly in his small cabin, he felt no regret. He had made a choice, a human choice, a kind choice, and whatever came next, he would face it. For now, she needed rest, and he would do everything he could to keep her safe. Elias woke early the next morning, long before the sun touched the far hills. His small wooden house felt quieter than usual, as if even the wind outside was listening. Nalin was resting in the small room he had given her, breathing slowly, her strength returning day by day. He checked on her, making sure she was comfortable, then stepped outside to feed the horses. But something in the air felt different. It was the stillness. Too deep, too heavy, like the calm that came before a change. As he stood beside the fence, he noticed dust rising far down the road. It was faint at first, just a soft blur against the sky. Then it grew clearer. Someone, or more likely several people, were riding toward his ranch. His chest tightened. Riders only came out this far if they had a reason. And lately, most visitors came with questions about the same thing, a missing woman from the Apache community. Elias looked back at the house. His simple, peaceful life had changed ever since he had found Nalin. He did not regret helping her, not even for a moment. But the truth was clear. If the riders came searching again, he could not allow them to discover her. Not when she was still recovering, not when she had done nothing wrong. He went inside quickly and gently woke her. She opened her eyes, still tired, but more aware than before. He told her that riders were approaching and that she needed to stay hidden for her own safety. She did not panic. Instead, she nodded calmly, trusting him completely. That trust settled heavily in his chest. Elias lifted a small wooden panel in the floor, revealing a storage space he rarely used. It was dry, clean, and hidden well enough that no one would notice unless they searched every inch of the house. He helped Nalin climb down carefully, placing a blanket and a small jug of water beside her. Before lowering the board again, he met her eyes. She gave him a small, grateful look that said more than words could. He placed the panel back and covered it with a rug, then stood up just as the sound of hooves drew close. The riders stopped right outside his gate, 3 of them. They called out to Elias, asking him to step outside for a moment. He walked out calmly, brushing dust off his shirt as if the morning were ordinary. The 3 men greeted him politely enough, but their expressions carried a quiet urgency. They explained that they were searching for someone who might have passed through this area. They described her as a young woman who needed help. Their words sounded gentler this time, different from the rumors he had heard earlier. Perhaps they were genuinely looking to bring her to safety, or perhaps they said what they needed to say to gain trust. Elias could not know for certain. They asked if he had seen anything unusual recently. Elias kept his voice steady, telling them he had been busy with ranch work and hadn't noticed anyone passing by. It wasn't a lie, not entirely. He had not seen anyone passing by. She wasn't passing by at all. She was injured and alone, until he found her. He spoke simply, as if his days had been quiet and calm, filled only with chores and the usual needs of the land. But the men didn't leave right away. They asked a few more questions about nearby paths, the direction of creeks, and whether any tracks had been spotted. Elias answered each question carefully, maintaining a calm expression. He could feel his heartbeat, slow but heavy, steady but alert. He knew he had to stay composed. He couldn't allow even a hint of worry to show. Finally, one of the men asked if they could inspect the area around the ranch, just in case someone had taken shelter there. Elias gave a thoughtful pause, as if considering the request. Inside, he felt a tight knot of concern, but he kept his tone collected. He agreed to let them look around the yard, but made it clear that the inside of his home was private. The men accepted this and stepped off their horses, walking around the barn, checking behind the sheds, and studying the ground for tracks. Elias followed them casually, keeping an eye on their movements without appearing nervous. Every now and then, one of the riders glanced toward the house, but none of them asked to enter. They seemed satisfied with the outside inspection, though their search was slow and careful. After several long minutes, they returned to their horses. One of them thanked Elias for his cooperation. Another told him to stay alert and report anything he might learn. Elias nodded politely, promising he would keep that in mind. The riders mounted their horses, turning back toward the main road. Slowly, their figures grew smaller until the dust behind them faded completely. When they were gone, Elias stayed still for a long moment, letting his breath settle. The weight that had been pressing on him since morning finally lifted bit by bit. He returned inside and gently removed the wooden panel. Nalin blinked up at him, waiting quietly. He reached down and offered his hand to help her climb back up. She stepped onto the floor with care, her legs still weak, but her spirit unshaken. She looked around as if confirming the house was safe again. Elias told her the riders had left, and she exhaled with relief. But she also noticed the strain in his voice. She thanked him softly, saying she knew he had taken a chance by protecting her. She understood the risk. Elias told her he did not help her because of chance or obligation. He helped because it was the right thing to do, and he would make the same choice again. In the days that followed, the atmosphere around the ranch changed. It was quieter, yet strangely warmer. Nalin spent more time sitting outside, wrapped in a blanket, watching the horses and the shifting colors of the sky. She healed slowly, but each day brought a little more strength. She learned a few simple English words, and Elias learned a few gentle words from her language. Their conversations were short, but meaningful. Even silence between them felt comfortable. Elias found himself noticing things he had overlooked before. The sound of her soft footsteps on the porch, the way she traced patterns in the dust with her fingers, the calmness she carried even after everything she had been through. She was thoughtful, observant, and quietly resilient. She brought a kind of peace into his home that he had not expected. At night, he sometimes sat outside under the stars, thinking about how differently things could have turned out. He had gone on a simple hunting trip one morning, expecting nothing more than the usual struggle for food. Instead, he returned carrying a life that needed protection, a life that now filled his home with quiet gratitude. Nalin began helping with small tasks when she was strong enough, folding blankets, tending the small garden, feeding the chickens. Her presence made the ranch feel less lonely. Elias realized he enjoyed her company more deeply than he had expected. What had begun as an act of kindness had grown into an unexpected bond. As the weeks passed, the riders never returned. The search faded from the area. The world beyond the ranch continued its rhythm, but Elias and Nalin had created a small place of safety and calm. She smiled more often, and her eyes no longer carried the same exhaustion they once held. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in soft gold, Nalin stood beside Elias on the porch. She looked at the wide horizon thoughtfully, then looked back at him. She didn't need to speak. Her eyes held a clear message, a deep, quiet wish to stay, at least for now, in the place where she had found safety and with the person who had offered it without asking for anything in return. Elias nodded gently, understanding without words. His life had changed the moment he carried her home, but it was not a change he regretted. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something built slowly and honestly, something that grew out of trust, kindness, and shared silence. He had left home that morning long ago searching for food, but he returned with a life that would reshape his days. And as the warm evening breeze moved across the porch, Elias knew he would not trade that choice for anything.